Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is the latest issue of Drezburt. I am Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and I write the Spoiler Alerts blog for the Washington Post.
And I'm Hurlburt. I run the New Models of Policy Change program at New America. And we are coming to you just 2 days or 3 days, depending on when we actually arrive at your screens, after the State of the Union was supposed to be killed, dead, never again. And Dan Drezner, I think rumors of its death were somewhat exaggerated.
Well, I would say only somewhat. My understanding is that the ratings for the State of the Union were actually at an all-time low. But the actual State of the Union, I would say in terms of the speech, it was interesting, just because that's possibly the most relaxed I've seen President Obama giving that speech. And at least on the foreign policy portions of the speech, I wouldn't say there was a lot of specifics. The only specifics he offered was, anything you, Congress, propose, I'm going to veto.
That's really specific, Drezner.
That's specific, but it's a negative specific. It's not. He's not saying what he's going to do. He's saying what he's not going to do. I think, I agree with you about the lack of specifics, but I would say, I'm going to go ahead and keep trying to get a deal with the Iranians. I am going to try to pass fast track and trade this year. Although, frankly, there was less on that than I thought there was going to be. Well, the other thing I was concerned about, I tweeted this, is that when he called for trade promotion authority, there was some applause, but I noticed Boehner didn't stand up, which I take as a bad sign for GOP support for this.
Well, I think I've even said this on this whatever the hell this is that we do. But
it's unique. We cannot define this, Heather. This is what it is, It's in its own category.
But I do think, Professor Drezner, I have pointed out to you in the past that Republican support was not as secure as you thought it would be. And I think, I didn't notice that about Boehner, but I think that's another indication that Republicans are still really not clear whether they want to give Obama any wins on anything, even if it's something that their own base and funders like.
Yes, no, I agree with that. As I said, I think, really, there was a lot of, I have to admit that I found a lot of the sort of commentary surrounding the State of the Union a bit silly, mostly because it was all this talk about how, oh my God, look at how relaxed Barack Obama is. He wasn't like this 2 months ago. Why wasn't he like this before the midterms? And I think the really easy answer to that is that there is a much stronger perception now in the American public that the economy is better than there was in the fall. So I think even if Obama had been like this in the fall, the accusation would have been, how can you be like this when the economy is still struggling?
Yeah, and I do think it's also very interesting the way various sets of approval ratings move together. So his approval rating is edging back toward 50%.
Right.
The economy is edging up, and interestingly, perceptions of how he's doing on national security are also edging up, which you might not expect given that we just had the attacks in France, and you frankly had a lot of Republicans yelling about how somehow that was all Barack Obama's fault.
Not just a lot of Republicans. You had people like Les Gelb and Tom Friedman, rending their garments about this as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of garment rending going on in the American foreign policy context among the experts these days, and I think, frankly, it's a little overdone, and I'm not quite sure why there's such a frenzy right now. Hegel said the other week that this was a moment of world upheaval unparalleled since World War II.
Chuck Hagel said that?
Yeah. And I thought, that would be surprising to the people who lived through decolonization.
I'm sorry, you didn't see me. I just committed suicide on
dear.
I'm sorry. I am so freaking sick of Chuck Hagel. Chuck Hagel's various pronouncements of, we've never had a world in this much turmoil. I blogged about this earlier this week. I think part of what's going on, at least with respect to the France business, is that in some ways, to be fair, this is an arena where what a lot of, not just Republicans, I think a lot of foreign policy people want the president to do is to recognize that this is in some ways a battle of ideas, that as much as the White House doesn't want to talk about this being related to radical Islam or what have you, that this really is a contestation of the sort of Western principles of liberalism versus non-Western principles, and that therefore this actually is a moment of political theater, as it were, where they want to see, Barack Obama offer a full-throated defense of, freedom of speech and what have you. And this is the one thing that Barack Obama does not do terribly well as president. He doesn't like to do it. He thinks its value is overrated, and therefore he's not going to do it. And I think this is what drives some people batty.
Well, I do think the other thing that's going on here, purely inside our little world, because really it's all about us, is that there is a bit of a generational shift taking place. And what was most remarkable to me about the Les Gelb piece in the Daily Beast was that, with the exception of Michel Flournoy, everyone he singled out as someone who should be brought into the administration was over 70, and a considerable number of them were over 80.
I thought they were all older than him. I thought that was the criteria. But yes, no, you're right. It was. I was genuinely stunned by that piece. I like Les Gelb. I've read a lot of his work. He normally comes across as very sober, but that was just a piece where it seemed like he had the vapors.
Well, I mean, Les was the chairman of my board, was a mentor, and was very gracious to me. And
he's also a Tufts alum and associated with the Fletcher School, so we're both. He's got his tentacles everywhere.
Yeah, but I think we are at this moment where the foundations of what seems feasible in American foreign policy have really shifted quite a lot from the last time that many people, including me, actually were holding office. And so there's and if you talk to the sort of exhausted people who have come out of the Obama administration, or frankly, if you talk to some of the exhausted Republican Hill staffers, they will say to you that that the field of maneuver is just not as big and obstacle free as maybe some of us with our fond memories of the 90s think of it as being.
Well, actually, this is a nice segue to the Republican response to the State of the Union, which came out yesterday, which is the announcement that they have invited Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address a joint session of Congress. Which he's done before. That's not out of the ordinary. What is out of the ordinary is that they did it first during the middle of an Israeli election season. So it's obviously a sort of way to elevate Netanyahu's status. But more importantly, they did it without consulting the White House, without consulting the executive branch. And clearly the reason they're doing it is because they want Netanyahu to make the case for imposing even more sanctions on Iran and to basically deep six the ongoing negotiations that are taking place. I just wrote something about this morning. This prompted a lot of sort of outrage reaction, not just from the older generation, but, from places like Vox or TPM saying, this is unprecedented and so forth. And my theory is very simple. In some ways, it matches what you say, which is this is just simply the executive branch and Congress trolling each other, engaging in a spiral war of trolling that actually has no necessarily real-world effects. I recognize the concern that some people have that somehow Netanyahu is going to move the needle on a vote by Congress to impose new sanctions, which would definitely sabotage the negotiations. But I don't think Netanyahu is going to move the needle enough. I don't think there's going to be enough Democrats who support this bill to override the veto. And therefore, this really is just a massive exercise in symbolism.
Well, it's an interesting point. If you're right, and Netanyahu
yes,
doesn't move the needle, then that's actually a significant display of weakness,
right.
Which, frankly, he and the groups in the U.S. who think this is a useful way to get what they want on Iran will have weakened themselves. So what's interesting is it may be that he can't win; he can only lose by doing this.
Well, first of all, I want my premise tested. You're closer to D.C. than I am. Do you think that there's actually enough votes for an override?
Well, frankly, what I thought we were moving toward, based on a couple of climb downs that happened actually the day of the State of the Union, where a hearing and a markup on a sanctions bill were canceled, and by some things that Senator Corker, who now chairs Senate Foreign Relations,
right.
said that we were actually moving toward where either the bill wouldn't be moved right away. The other really interesting thing that was happening at the same time is that Barbara Boxer and Rand Paul are moving an alternate bill.
Oh. Okay.
Which was designed, and if you think about it, Barbara Boxer, both because she's a very popular liberal Democrat and because she's an American Jew very strongly identified with the pro-Israel security community, and Rand Paul because he's very prominently identified as anti-war, but also seeking to get the Republican nomination and not totally alienate Republican hawks.
Right.
So that was a really interesting development, in and of itself, and I think it presages a little bit sort of how you're going to see things move in this Congress. But, so absent Netanyahu coming to town, I think all sides were concluding that it might not be in anyone's interest to pass a bill and have it get vetoed.
Right.
And it might either be better to pass a weaker bill or not pass a bill and then frankly be able to complain that Barack Obama did sort of save it as a talking point for the
Republicans.
Republicans.
In other words, if the negotiations broke down, they can say, if we'd only passed this, if the White House, yeah.
Right, but does Netanyahu coming here force the Republicans' hand? And then, as I said, if it fails, that's a loss of actual power as opposed to symbolic power.
I wonder two things on this. First, I don't know if you saw this story, but Josh Rogan and Eli Lake had a story on Bloomberg today about the fact that while Netanyahu clearly wants a tougher sanctions bill, the Mossad has actually made it clear to members of Congress that this is not a good idea. That their position is basically in lockstep with the Obama administration, which is to say this is the guaranteed way to sabotage the negotiations. It doesn't give the United States any more leverage. So one wonders if that would give at least some members of Congress an out. Not to mention the fact that people like David Cameron have also said that they don't think it's terribly useful. The second thing is that I wonder if there can be a draw on this in the sense of Netanyahu comes to speak, the vote goes before Congress, Obama vetoes it, the veto holds, but the veto barely holds. In other words, you get majorities in both houses of Congress and maybe like 60% rather than 2/3. I could see that as a scenario where I understand that in the real world policy implications, it's a defeat for Congress. But I wonder in terms of the perceptions game, if it wouldn't be quite the sign of weakness that you're suggesting.
Well, the only thing there is you are supposing that the veto would have held some other way without Netanyahu. And, I think if and when you get to the point of overriding a veto, there will be a very careful negotiation between the White House and Senate Democrats about who gets to vote with the Republicans.
Is it in the Senate? Because I was actually wondering if the House is going to stop it. I mean, I'm assuming Pelosi's got in some ways Pelosi has better discipline over her members than, the Senate Democrats do.
You may be right.
Okay.
And there's also, the other interesting thing is you've got maybe as many as 25 or 30 Republicans who share Rand Paul's pro-negotiation views, but who don't have the handicap of trying to get the Republican nomination for president. I did want to go back and say something though about the Israeli elections.
Sure, please.
Which are very close,
right.
Very interesting. And, back to sort of speaking of nostalgia for the 90s, I was working in government when Netanyahu ran a campaign in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I said to a source who shall remain anonymous, I said, if hypothetically an American government official wanted to do something that would help Netanyahu's opponent in this election, what hypothetically would that official do? And my source said to me, it's obvious, endorse Netanyahu. And so I wonder if there isn't a bit of an overplaying of the hand here, because Israelis, number one, do not like to be reminded of the extent to which they are dependent on the U.S. And number two, do not like the sense that Netanyahu is weakening their relationship with the U.S., and that's been one of the criticisms of him. So if he comes here, and it's highly controversial, and it's obvious that not everyone in Congress is jumping up in perfect unanimity to applaud every time he opens his mouth, which I think will be the case, unlike last time, it's not at all guaranteed that this will actually help him. So
I'm just curious, if you're the White House and you know he's coming, is one of the ways that you can, retaliate is by, in fact, making sure there is no photo op at the White House?
I'm sure that's something that they are debating the pros and cons of. The problem with that being that it also comes right before the annual APAC policy conference here in Washington. So as the president, and I might also add the vice president, you have an interesting dance to do about, are you more interested in trying to sway what happens in the Israeli elections, or are you more interested in preserving your own kind of minimal levels of, now, if you were to quickly stage a foreign trip and find yourself out of the country or unavoidably on the West Coast, I think that, that's what they used to pay me the big bucks for, Drezner.
Now I know how I'm staffing up when I go run for office.
Right. But just one last thing that I wanted to say, which is not an original thought to me, but I think it was Ali Grabe who pointed out that in a way this is a return favor for the visit that Romney made to Israel.
Right.
And we all remember how well that worked out.
Yes, exactly.
So, I see, this is an interesting gambit, but I think a lot of the assumptions about how beneficial it will be for its instigators are quite possibly going to be proven.
No, I think we're on the same page, which is why, frankly, I have to admit, as just a foreign policy watcher, I'm just eating my popcorn and watching, because really, this is it's at least entertaining, if nothing else.
Well, it does raise. I just want to mention one other thing, which is kind of interesting, that I see as an interesting parallel to this, is that the Pope is coming in the fall.
Oh, okay.
And the Pope is also addressing Congress, and we have a lot more time to make the popcorn for that one. But that one is a similarly one where I think lots of people will be anticipating that certain things will happen, and I think one would be greatly mistaken to feel confident about how that will play out. But I love imagining how the Vatican diplomats are trying to figure out how to play the various forces in American politics who want to use the Pope in various ways. And so far, he's been pretty good at using groups that want to use him. Yeah. So that's the one I'm saving my extra butter for.
Fair enough. I look forward to that visit as well. And I then look forward to the, television spinoff entitled That Pope. But we should now segue to other parts of the world that are not going as well. The first one that comes to mind is Ukraine.
Have we had anything further this morning? I confess I was busy reading up on Yemen, but has there been any further definitive information about whether whether we can confirm that there actually are Russian army personnel doing the fighting?
I have also not checked this morning. I'm not aware, but all we know is that the fighting is clearly intensified, and I think the most alarming statement I've seen over the last couple of days was a Russian deputy prime minister basically saying that if this continues, Ukraine is threatening its territorial integrity, which of course is kind of a joke because their territorial integrity is already
what territorial integrity?
Exactly, yes, but it suggests that the conflict is not dying down, that the Minsk Accords are a joke, and that clearly, I think as Spencer Ackerman pointed out during the State of the Union, Vladimir Putin might be, in a global sense, far weaker than he was a year ago, but nonetheless, his troops are in Ukraine and he's controlling territory.
Yeah. Although this is sort of the combination of weakness and strength here, as it continues to appear that he doesn't know what his end game is.
Yes, that's a fair point. Although I would argue that in some ways, I think that's also true of the West. I mean, the end game. I think the West endgame, I'm assuming, is one in which the Minsk Accords actually get implemented. All of Ukraine except the Crimea, is under the control of the central government in Kiev. But that strikes me as, at this point, a demand too far for the Putin regime. And as you say, you're right. It's not entirely clear what he wants out of this.
Well, and I was going to add cynically about what the West wants is ideally what the West also wants is not to be left with the entire bill for reconstructing a more or less integral Ukraine.
Right.
But,
which is going to be, the fascinating thing for me during all of this has been, in some ways, you can argue that this is a classic test of sort of realism in international relations theory. because, if you go back to your Ken Waltz, one of the arguments is that the international environment is so scary, it's so anarchic, that in the end, states have to engage in self-help in order to be sure that they survive over time. And you can argue that for 20 years or 25 years, Ukraine basically did not have to worry about that they were sort of gifted sovereignty, and, it was sort of a genuinely inoffensive kleptocratic state that really didn't do all that much and didn't matter all that much. But with the events of the Maidan and with the Russian occupation of the Crimea, suddenly it occurred to the Ukrainians that, wow, their sovereignty is actually threatened. And this could have been a moment where the Poroshenko government actually could have used the specter of a Russian threat to truly weed out corruption and strengthen the Ukrainian state. And I've heard mixed reports from sort of the Ukrainian experts I trust, but increasingly what I'm hearing is genuine skepticism that anything is actually going to change on the Ukrainian side of things, which does put the West in an extremely awkward position, because on the one hand, they don't want Ukraine, basically being a satellite state of Russia, but on the other hand, if the specter of a territorial carve-out doesn't cause the Ukrainian government to get its act together, I'm not sure what will.
Well, I think there's two things a little off with with that analysis, and that is that by the time of the Maidan...
Okay. No, go ahead.
What's that on your grading scale? If I think there's only two flaws in your argument.
That's an A-, but go ahead.
Ooh, smushy.
Yeah.
So by the time of the Maidan, the balance is already askew and the opportunity is past. That as much as I love the West and as much as I empathize with those in Ukraine who would like to adhere more closely to the West and get out from under the kleptocratic Russian sort of pseudo-capitalist, pseudo-democratic model, the thing that upsets the balance you were talking... True that glitch in the recording is Drezner breaking down in tears because I told him there were flaws in his argument. Just in case you were wondering. But no, I mean, by the time of the Maidan, you've already irreparably tipped the balance that was allowing Ukraine to be sort of an inoffensive buffer state. And by the initiative that seemed to promise to everybody concerned that Ukraine could instead ally somewhat more closely with the West, you've then created a situation in which Russia decides it's going to do whatever it's going to do in response. So the Maidan's not the tipping point, if you will. What happens to cause the Maidan is the tipping point.
Yeah. No,
and I do also think that, and not to excuse the weaknesses of the Poroshenko government, but I think taking an aggressive stance against corruption and for significant reform while the eastern third of your country is being munched off is a little much to expect.
I would ordinarily say yes, but again, it's precisely because of that threat that I think it is a crisis, which is also an opportunity. But I mean, I guess my question to you is, how do you see this playing out in the end? I mean, is there an end game, or are we basically, is this just going to be another frozen conflict we have across the former Soviet space?
That's certainly what I see as the most likely outcome. And frankly, if we could get it a little more frozen, that would already be an improvement. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's only if you could get into the frozen conflict stage that you could then have any hope of the government in Kiev getting itself in order and making itself more functional. Okay. Which, if you think about it, to the extent that there's been progress in governance in, say, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and it's very much been a step forward, a step back in all those places. Mm-hmm. But none of the progress came while the conflicts were hot.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
It's not a particularly cheerful one, because in as much as I do think right now the international community has no idea how to get the conflict to freeze, in part because if you're Russia, you don't really have any incentive to freeze it.
Well, you do have one incentive to freeze it. I mean, if the Russian economy continues to implode, then you can argue that one of the gambits that Putin can pursue is to somehow ease pressure off of the sanctions. So, I mean, I think one of the things that this isn't actually strictly, obviously this isn't only because of the sanctions, but, the plummeting oil price and a variety of other things that are wrong with the Russian economy really do seem to be coming to a head. And Russia looks like it's going to have a disastrous economic year this year. So one does wonder at what point will there be internal pressure on Putin to change course. Although I have to admit, given the politics of Russia, I'm not sure that that's going to necessarily be all that powerful.
Yeah, ironically, I fear that actually the extent of the drop in oil price kind of shot us back past the place where hypothetically there could have been pressure from Russia's commercial classes to get the sanctions taken off. And now you have to ask yourself, even if the sanctions all came off tomorrow, Russia's still in an enormous hole.
Right.
And I wonder from, it's sort of not worth trying to get the sanctions taken off because you still have the much bigger problem, and because you have no possibility of hiding from the populace just how big your economic problem because of the oil prices is, then your pressure to stand taller on the security/national pride front rather than make concessions on that front. So my worry is that this makes it harder rather than easier for Russia to step back. I mean, I'd love to be wrong.
No. I think I don't necessarily strongly disagree with you. It's a depressing state of affairs, which leads us to a nice segue to Yemen, which I have not paid any attention to, I confess. So I will be happy to hear your take, as given that was what you were reading about this morning.
Right. Well, I think just the thing to say about Yemen, on which I am not an expert, and I am hereby not being one of those people who is magically a Yemen expert because something happened in Yemen. And if you want to follow a real Yemen expert, follow Greg Johnson and follow the people that he follows. And those are people who really have spent large amounts of time in Yemen and know something about it. But sort of the short thing to be sure that people understand is there's a civil war in Yemen. There has been a civil war in Yemen for a long time. There are, in fact, multiple civil wars in Yemen. And the sides in Yemen's civil war have teamed up with various regional players. So you have one side that's somewhat loosely affiliated with Iran and Hezbollah, and another side that's somewhat loosely affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And so the U.S.
Well, that's just a wonderful choice to have. Sorry, go ahead.
Hey, man, welcome to the Middle East.
Yeah.
People need to understand that that's the one of the fundamental things that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. When you get excited about this or that bad guy in the Middle East. So the U.S. initially goes into Yemen because Al-Qaeda goes to Yemen, but over time, the drone program and the exigencies of getting the government to let us keep using the drone program has led the drone program to become a bit of an auxiliary in Yemen's civil wars. So as power shifts in Yemen's civil wars, there comes this question, there's two questions. One is the U.S. going to be allowed to continue to do what it has been doing? Number two, is that program a long-term good idea if it is helping to fuel instability and civil conflict in Yemen? And then number three, you have to sort of mesh that with what we saw in France, which is that despite the fact that the drone program in Yemen has prevented any attacks on the U.S. coming from Yemen and has prevented a certain level of growth and export by Al-Qaeda, it didn't prevent them from training and inspiring at least some of these folks in France. So, it's just a moment to kind of stop and say, hey, wait, is this really doing what we want it to be doing?
I suppose the obvious question to ask, and again, I know I'm even less of a Yemen expert than you are, is except the only thing I know is that Yemen was. I knew that the U.S. Middle East policy was in trouble when, at various points, the Obama administration has talked about Yemen as a model for how to deal with other countries, which is not encouraging. Can Yemen, devolve to the point where it's basically another Syria, in terms of they're not just being an out-and-out civil war, but they're, correct me if I'm wrong, the civil war exists in Yemen, but there hasn't been nearly the loss of life that there was in Syria.
Correct. I mean, in part because Yemen is a fairly sparsely populated. I mean, Yemen's not Syria. Mm-hmm. Yemen's a sparsely populated country, and it's not nearly as intermixed mm-hmm. a country. So you have, sort of groups can go, to some extent, can go back to their corners, mm-hmm. if you will. So it's not going to be another Syria in that. I mean, the way that it is another Syria, or potentially another Syria, is that it has large ungoverned spaces. Mm. Has much larger ungoverned spaces. And so, not in terms of generating internal carnage on the level of Syria's, but in terms of having a space where anybody who needs a space to organize, where, nobody asks too many questions. Now, the good news is it's not also rife with oil and antiquities, so you can't organize in Yemen and make a lot of money there. But it's a large, increasingly ungoverned space.
Speaking of large, equally ungoverned spaces, this is the week in which the World Economic Forum is taking place in Davos. Now, I understand that you have actually attended this forum before.
Now, the funny thing about me going to Davos is that it was both tremendously glamorous and tremendously unglamorous, right?
Okay, do tell. As someone who has never been to Davos and is not bitter at all about that fact, please go ahead.
So, the way that I went to Davos is that in 2000, I wrote the speech that President Clinton gave at Davos. So we all got on Air Force One the day after the State of the Union, which sounds super glamorous, except that everyone was exhausted and, barely coherent, which is not very, and everyone already starts out much less good looking than they are on the West Wing, and then you sort of add them barely coherent and snarly. Uh-huh. Not especially glamorous. We landed somewhere in Switzerland and then, went into Davos by helicopter, which fabulously glamorous. I got to fly through the Swiss Alps in a helicopter. It's amazingly beautiful. Mm-hmm. I have to tell you, I hate helicopters. Oh. I do not like flying on helicopters. Land in Davos, right? Wow, it's amazingly glamorous, and Clinton's giving a speech, and finally my draft is done, and I have free day in Davos, okay. Right? I mean, how glamorous is that? Mm-hmm. Can I go skiing? Can I sneak off and go skiing? No, in my business suit, I cannot go skiing. I am sitting at a hotel with a pool. Do I have a swimsuit to go in the fabulous pool at the hotel? No, I do not. Do I have a badge that will let me go into any events and rub shoulders with the rich and fabulous? Oh. No, I do not.
Oh, I see.
I spent a day at Davos sitting by the pool in my business suit, clutching a Diet Coke, trying frantically to stay awake. And then it was snowing too hard to helicopter back out of Davos, so I then drove back from Davos to our airplane in a cavalcade of minivans, super glamorous, of which the most glamorous part was that I spent quite a while chatting with Eric Holder, who at that time was a somewhat higher level functionary than I was, but still, mm-hmm. like me, a functionary rather than a cabinet secretary. So last anecdote, which is not glamorous but was really funny. So there was a huge internal fight about what Clinton was going to say at Davos, because remember, this is only 2 months after the battle in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And we were stringently told by the Davos authorities that the speech could only be 20 minutes long.
Sorry. Bill Clinton only 20 minutes.
3-hour tour. Yes. So we cut.
That's like that's like telling a Castro he's only got 3 hours to speak, but go ahead.
We fight. And I'm in the staff room watching this speech on video. Mm-hmm. And as Clinton gets to about minute 35, yes. He looks out at the audience, and I will remind you, this is January 2000, mm-hmm. and he says to the audience, as my daughter Chelsea likes to say, denial is more than a river in Egypt. And a dozen heads of people who are now senior economic advisors in the Obama administration swivel and glare at me. I didn't write that. I promise I didn't put that in there.
that is the saddest, funniest Davos story I have ever heard, Heather. So I take it, this is good because it makes me not miss. Not that I terribly wanted to attend, but I am curious, just as an experience to see what it would be like. But I have to say, living vicariously through that story is satisfaction enough.
Well, David Shore and I on Twitter were trying to make the argument that not going to Davos is the new Davos.
Oh yeah, but I mean I hear this every year. I think I even wrote an op-ed like a long time ago in the LA Times making that point.
But in all seriousness, public radio had such a glorious, like every year you think there can't be a more embarrassing story about Davos. Mm-hmm. And an individual who's a real estate mogul, whose name I forget, sadly, apparently got up at Davos yesterday and and I remind you again that he made his money in real estate.
Right.
And asserted that Americans were too consumerist and that for us to find happiness as a society, we were going to have to downsize our expectations and our way of living.
Wow. Okay.
A gentleman who had arrived in Davos on his private jet with his wife, his kids, and not one nanny but two nannies.
I will simply close by pointing out that the nice thing, the thing that Davos is useful for is generating all sorts of, worrying rumors that turn out usually not to pan out. My memory of last year's Davos was the sort of takeaway story from last year's Davos, if you remember, was basically the Japanese prime minister and various Chinese officials saying, we are basically on the dawn of, it's like World War I or the start of World War I in the Pacific Rim. And there were all these sorts of hysterical stories of, yes, they're bound to go to war at any minute. And as I pointed out in the post, that did not happen. Not because it just didn't happen, but because there were active efforts to at least somewhat diffuse the conflict out there. So, I'm looking forward to equally, scary rumors that turn out not to pan out from this conference. And I'm hoping there is at least one shot of Tom Friedman in a hideous leather jacket.
I'm giving the screen a pitying look. Because, frankly, that's really all I can think of to do. All right, well, here's to horrible rumors that don't pan out,
yes,
Professor Drezner. And it is not a rumor, it is a dead certitude that we will see you all in a month, at which time I promise that I will talk about the budget and Drezner will not want to.
There we go. Take care.
Bye-bye.